Hello, I'm Steph Morrison from the Canadian Schoolhouse, and I am here with a guest, as we usually like to have on, just to bring up topics for your homeschooling life in whatever way that is, for you just to get more skills in teaching your kids. And this one is specifically on critical thinking skills. So I am joined with Mike here, Mike Zietsma. I said that right, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay. Mike Zietsma from Creating History. And so, Mike, you create it's history courses, social sciences topics as well, like social studies.
Yeah. So I primarily focus on high school social sciences right now. I do hope to get into grade 7 and 8 in the next year or so.
Oh, great.
But I produce a Canadian civics course for grade 9 and 10, Canadian history for grade 10, US history for grade 11. And then I've just finished my new world history course, which is typically for grades 11 and 12. And that focuses on the Renaissance period all the way to the present.
Hmm. Hmm. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about because the reason I think you're such an expert on critical thinking skills is you really put that into a lot of your courses, probably all your courses. Um,
Yeah, yeah, it's an essential skill, and often history can be reduced to just dates and facts.
mhm,
And for kids who cannot necessarily memorize things well, history can become very frustrating, very boring.
mhm,
But it's important to remember that those dates and facts, that's only the starting point. And that creates a framework to look at things more deeply, which leads to the development of critical thinking skills. So, for example, if we look at the French Revolution, which is what we're going to look at today, and we just think about Louis the 16th, Marie Antoinette, who were they, 1789 to 1799. If we just look at those dates, again, that's important, but it's
mhm.
much deeper than that. And so critical thinking very much revolves around making deeper connections between concepts. And also, I think from a Christian perspective, you know, it very much helps us understand who we are as humans throughout history and our need for a savior.
Mhm.
And so if history is just left to those dates and facts, I think that's unfortunate because, that again, that's only the starting point.
Mhm. I think from my experience in history going through school and specifically high school, it was really boring for me. It was probably one of my worst subjects, and I was a fairly good student in school. I would get very good marks. And it was just that reason that I think it was really boring to me. There was no relating it in my mind anyway, and those experiences. And now, or in many years, I really have enjoyed reading about history. And I think the big thing what it was is I started really just reading stories of people talking about history, not in a textbook style, but in it be and it was thought provoking. It brought up
Mhm.
different thoughts and ideas, and just almost like revelations in my mind about those events, and how it's related, whether it's related directly to today or just related to the way our world is now. It's all kind of related in different ways, and I'm trying to get that in there with my kids. And I will say, I don't think I'm great at building critical thinking skills in my boys. Now they are 12 and 15. So any of you watching, I think we can build critical thinking skills. I mean, this is really something we can start from the beginning.
Mhm.
Am I correct in that? Like, I could be with my 6-year-old and creating conversations maybe that are challenging him to kind of think deeper. And is that sort of what we can think of critical thinking skills? That's sort of what I think. Like, I want my kids to think well, along with read
Yeah,
well and write well. But that's one of the main things I want to achieve. That's what I know I sort of been. That's my goalpost for educating my kids, at least when they're with me. I want them to think well, and that I think is what critical thinking skills are.
Yeah, it encompasses all of those different things, right? And taking those events from the past, evaluating things like change, continuity, opposing forces, prominent themes, and all of those things help to develop critical thinking. And critical thinking is something that's applicable to all of life,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not when we study history. Sometimes kids think, well, I'm not going to go and study history beyond this, or how is this relevant? Well, critical thinking is the ability to make effective decisions based on evaluating important factors. That's something that's applicable in all of life.
Mm-hmm.
And with all the different things happening culturally within our society, the ability to evaluate those things and to draw in conclusions or to see trends, all of those skills are developed from looking at history.
Mm-hmm.
And his change is always happening. And I say it to my students, change can be drastic, like in the case of the stock market crash of 1929. Change can be incremental. Change can be positive. Change can be negative. And so it's always happening. And we see that's one of the prominent themes when we look at history. And to be able to, I think when studying with your son or daughter, to identify a prominent theme that they are learning from the study of a particular topic, that's a good starting point. And then fusing that with a critical thinking question where, okay, you know what, after we're done this material, we're going to be able to evaluate this particular question in depth, and we're working towards that. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's how I designed the course as well, too, to have weekly critical thinking central questions for each of the topics so that there's a defined focal point. And then at the end of the week, students develop those skills as well, too. And they continue to work on them each of the weeks, because if you think about skill development, I teach phys ed as well, too. And, if you think about throwing a baseball, you only get better at throwing a baseball by doing it again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And if you throw it once, that skill's not going to develop. And so same thing here with history. If we're going to evaluate, change and all its different things that it encompasses, we have to continue to look at that and evaluate that and see that with different topics and so on. And then students get better at identifying those particular themes, which help to develop critical thinking skills.
Mm-hmm. I think so much of our learning time, homeschooling time, that schooling time we have with our kids, is to cover those subjects that are more just question and answer and learn. When I think of math and language arts, it's skills, and you're building on skills, and it's not. You can do those courses and do all that kind of type of learning without really developing any critical thinking skills. It doesn't, I mean, I can see how that can be put in to those subjects as well. But I feel like I've done that a bit myself, where I've kind of just, okay, we got to get these core subjects in, and I want to cover those, and I want them to be really accomplished in those areas. But I see now at the ages my boys are, that they don't have these skills that that are really important. As you said, it's kind of important in every area
Mhm.
of our lives. So I'm going to throw out a situation that just happened yesterday, and I'm going to say God just put that in there just so I'd have it to ponder and share with the audience, because maybe you've had something similar like this happen, and you can maybe direct on, oh, what would have been a better way, or maybe that's, hey, that's just a progression on continuing to build that skill. So we were doing science, and the question, and it was on biodiversity. So there's a question of um, define biodiversity and consider why it's important that we study biodiversity.
Mhm.
So my son was good. He could even look back and get the nice definition for biodiversity, but he just he could not seem to think on his own why it's important. And the answers he kind of gave were sort of the same. Well, it's important that we learn about this stuff, and it's important,
Mhm.
and I gave him, so, I tried to help him. I gave a few minutes for him just to think on it, because I think that's important. We need to give our kids, a few minutes to ponder that. And then And then I gave him a few ideas. Okay, well, I think it's important to know because it's God's creation. We have dominion. God has given us dominion over all the land and animals, and we should know how they work and how they function and what they need and all that kind of stuff. It's also a source of our food, and we need to know about that. And he actually even just so I put out all those things, and he still really had a hard time defining that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe using that example, could you direct that maybe there's another sort of type of question I could have given him? Now, this is my 12-year-old, so I guess you can consider the age as well if that's
Yeah.
important. But what could be done in that situation of just asking questions? I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a few different variables there. So first of all, when we look at the ability to look more deeply into topics, like I teach from grade 9 to 12, and I teach the same kids quite often, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll have a student in grade 10 who I'm introducing critical thinking to, and they're really struggling with it. But by grade 12, I can quite often notice a significant difference
Hmm.
in their ability to look at things more deeply. And so part of that is dealing with just basic brain development. And you can really see that, especially with teaching the same kids over a longer period of time, that they do develop in those areas. And so placing them in situations where, yeah, they do struggle to kind of come to see those deeper connections, that's okay because they're still in the process of developing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of overarching to important to understand. And another more practical thing I would say is how and what questions tend to be most effective.
How and what questions?
How and what questions tend to evoke more of a critical thinking response than simply why.
Yeah.
So you can see with the questions, the central questions that I've phrased for the course, quite often I'll use how and what. And that tends to lead in the direction more so of getting them to evoke a response. But I think too is just like if you think about developing a skill of throwing a baseball,
Mm-hmm.
at first that if when it's just introduced, for some kids it's going to come naturally, quite quickly. Other kids it's going to take a little bit more to develop, but to consistently go back to it and continue to work at it. And don't expect that critical thinking is just going to be right away, right? Develop right away. It's a process, and it's important that those kids are placed in those positions where they're not just gathering information, but like the questions you asked, which I think are good questions, they're forced to evaluate beyond just the simple facts. And they might not get it right away, but continue to work at it, and over time, then a parent is more likely to see progress.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that little personal tip. And I hope it helped any of you watching. So let us know how you work that into your course. So we have a few of the documents, the files you have
Yep.
in your courses. So feel free to say specifically what you're going to start with first, and Christine will put that up. But let us know how that critical thinking and how you form your courses, because I think it's really
Sure.
it's really
So
helpful.
let's start with the course summary sheet. There we go. So a little bit about this course, first of all, is it's world history and the West. So it essentially is the study of how the West became the West. And it's a very relevant course because we, of course, live in the West, and the quality of life in the West is unprecedented in human history.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of individual freedoms and so on, that's unprecedented. And the story of the course is, well, how did this come to be? And it covers from the Renaissance to the 21st century. And in this course, we look at the good, the bad, and everything in between of history. And I think that's really important that we work from that framework, that we don't just choose things just to say that, okay, the West is perfect. And we don't just choose things to say, oh, the West is horrible, but we look at all of these different things here. and present that information, and we encourage students to draw their own conclusions. And quite often when we're looking at an expanse of time of 700 to 800 years, everything about who we are as humans and our need for a savior is going to be revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this course, you're going to see the greatness of humans and their innovation and their courage. But also we're going to see times of great failure as well too, because we see the evidence of sin just as we do today. Of course, we see that in the past as well too. So I work from that framework that we have to look at it all. And by looking at it all, that places students in a situation where they are forced to evaluate and critically think.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of education nowadays is a predefined narrative and then simply choosing facts to fit that predefined narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a real challenge within education as a whole, that we don't just slip into this, okay, here's the conclusion, and just find information to fit that conclusion. Well, no, we look at all the evidence, and then from all the evidence, we draw conclusions from that. So start with the Renaissance, and each week is a different topic. And so I find it really neat course to study, and I teach this with my own students as well too, because every week is a new exciting topic. And if you turn to the next page, the focal point of each weekly topic is the central question. And so this again is where critical thinking comes in, is that there's a defined focal point here. So we have different questions here. And so let's start with the first one here, exploration and encounter. Was the West the perpetrator and the peoples they encounter or conquered simply their victims? And so students start off each week with a central question. And then on the first day is a narrated lecture. The second day is typically a documentary evaluation. The third day is usually a map animation analysis. So with the course comes a subscription to a website called themapishistory.com. And they produce great animated maps of what's going on relating to particular topics. Thursday is usually looking at primary resources or secondary resources or particular articles. And then the Friday is a set of skills that they develop in something called the thematic package. We'll get to that in a moment. And the culmination of the week within that package is the central question of the week. So again, we start off with that central question. And at the beginning of the week, when students hear, was the West the perpetrator and the peoples they conquered simply their victims, they're not necessarily going to be able to answer that question right away. And so as the week goes on, they look at different types of evidence, and things become more clear one way or the other. And by the end of the week, they're able to evaluate that. So for example, exploration and encounter, that deals with, the 14 and 1500s. And it deals with different explorers, famous explorers like Columbus and so on, Hernan Cortez. And when looking at all those different things, we can certainly see where these explorers and these societies, they brutalized many indigenous people. So we can see that. And so we can see evidence there that, okay, this was wrong. But then if we look a little bit deeper, particularly relating to, for example, Hernan Cortez, the Spanish, and the Aztecs. The Aztecs, prior to the Spanish, they subjugated all of the indigenous tribes around them. And Montezuma was their ruler. And this was a society, too, where they had human worship, human sacrifice, and so on. And so when we think about that and say, like, okay, the Aztecs, they were the perpetrator to the indigenous peoples around them. And when the Spanish came and they conquered the Aztecs, the Spanish did a lot of those things to the Aztecs, which the Aztecs had done to others. And it doesn't make it right at all. Both are wrong. But it forces students to evaluate the question, was the West the perpetrator and all the people they encountered the victims? it becomes more complex because history is complex. And so when we look at a topic like that, we look at different things throughout the week. And so the first week as well, too, we also look at a primary resource by I believe he was a Catholic priest, Bartolomeo de las Casas. And he wrote a letter to the Pope about how the Spanish had been brutalizing and enslaving indigenous people. And so there were people who stood up and said, no, this is wrong. This needs to stop. And so again, we gather evidence from the week. And then by the end of the week, students are able to evaluate the central question of the week. And each of these central questions, they also appear on the midterm and the final exam. So again, kids are building a set of skills that they're continually coming back to and are able to work on multiple times in order to get better at that particular skill. And so these are all the different central questions. And I have one here for the French Revolution as well, too. French Revolution is always a very interesting topic, high level of interest from students there. And so the question for the French Revolution week is, did the French Revolution truly reflect enlightened ideals referring to the Enlightenment, or were they simply used by the leaders of the movement to gain further power? So what preceded the French Revolution was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is arguably the most significant development in Western history. You know, the fact that we have an education system, that we have empiricism where we use evidence to draw conclusions, and we have a democratic system of government that all stems from the Enlightenment. And so when students hear this question here, you know, was the French Revolution truly reflecting Enlightened ideals? Or was it simply a power grab? At the beginning of the week, they're not going to be able to answer that question. But after doing the lecture, evaluating, a documentary critique, reading some articles, evaluating different primary resources and so on, then they're able to, that question becomes more clear. And so at the end of the week, the culmination of every week is a particular set of critical thinking skills. And so I put this together in a thematic package. And so this, what you're looking at here, is a thematic package, which is what students would do at the end of the week. And they do this package in 3 different forms. They can either do it in a physical form like this. They can have a discussion with their parents, or they can produce a brief informal video clip where they are presenting their conclusions. And so I rotate those 3 different options. So they're working on these skills in 3 different ways. So they're working on it in terms of writing down. They're working on it in terms of conversation skills. And they're also working on their presentation orally. So here we have not only critical thinking skills being developed, but we also have more practical skills relating to literacy, communication, and interaction. So the set of skills that are developed, if we can turn to the next page there. So again, each of these skills questions are evaluated each week. And so at the end of the French Revolution week, students will look at, well, what are some central and connecting issues? For example, we have the French Revolution, but what's connected to the French Revolution are things like the abuse of power by the French monarch, enlightened ideals, and the different waves of enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and so on, who came before that. So students would identify those connecting issues. Next, we have concepts that work together. So this led to that. So here we can say that, well, the first wave of enlightened thinkers, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they set the groundwork for other enlightened thinkers like Voltaire, who had his own issues, but nonetheless, him and people like Montesquieu and so on, they developed further thoughts based on the first wave. And then we, of course, have how this message was transmitted through the salons of Paris. So a room in each home of French middle class was called a salon. And this is where they would discuss enlightened ideals.
Hmm.
And the enlightened ideals ultimately led to this idea that, we can make life better by overthrowing the king and trying to put in place greater rights and freedoms. There's a big question mark on that in the way in which that was done, as we look at, throughout the week with the French Revolution. Also opposing forces. So here within the French Revolution, we have, traditional monarchies in opposition to enlightened ideals. So those are opposing forces. And we can look even further. We can look at centralized power versus decentralized power. And then prominent cultural values, that's going to vary with each generation and so on. And so at this time here, prominent cultural values, those are drastically changing. So what's interesting with the French Revolution is they tried to completely get rid of the Catholic Church and Christianity in all its forms during the Reign of Terror with Robespierre. And he even redid the French calendar. Instead of 7 days a week, it was 10 days a week. And he also developed a new religion called the Cult of the Supreme Being.
Who'd you say that was?
What's that?
Who was that did that?
So that was Maximilien Robespierre. So the leader of the French Revolution during the Reign of Terror, the early 1790s.
Yeah.
So this is the first set of skills that they work on. And what I find is the first time my students do these, they don't do well in them. But each week, they get remarkably better at doing it. Because again, if you keep on working at throwing a baseball, you're going to get better at it.
Yeah.
But if it's a one and done thing here where they just evaluate opposing forces 1 week instead of for each of the topics, they get better at it each week. And so I think that gets back to, your earlier question with your son, is continue to work at those skills and asking those questions, because students will get better at it. So the next page, we continue to work on developing critical thinking. And if we could just get the next page there. There we go. So the next thing that students evaluate at the end of each week is change and continuity. So change is always happening. And I mentioned before that change can be drastic, change can be incremental, change can be positive, change can be negative. So when we look here at change, some examples of change, we could say political structure is an example of change, where we have the monarchy of France being overthrown and a provisional democratic government being set up. Continuity, we could say French power, because France still remained a significant power within Europe. And during the French Revolution, 1790s, you have all this internal turmoil within France, but France is also fighting its neighbors. And a little man by the name of Napoleon is part of that picture, which we hear about later on in the course. And so France is still a significant European power at this time. And so I encourage kids to evaluate that, to identify a particular theme of change or topic and support it with an example. And so that's where I have the boxes there for examples. And then I also ask students, is there an example of transformational change that has greatly altered Western civilization or the world? And the French Revolution has indeed been transformational. And again, it's not a smooth picture at all. It really is in many ways a mess. But nonetheless, other neighboring nations and people groups, they saw what happened both with the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which happened prior to the French Revolution. And they saw that the average person could rise up and promote change and even possibly overthrow an oppressive monarch. And that looked different across Europe. And so after the French Revolution, from 1800 to the 1850s, there is massive change in terms of the development of individual ethnic groups within Europe seeking more power. And it culminates with the revolutions of 1848, which is actually the most revolutionary year in European history. And so the French Revolution started the ball rolling very much, and that resulted in significant change over a very long period of time, change that we can still feel today. So students are encouraged to work on evaluating these particular tasks. And then if we can turn to the next page. So here I encourage students to identify prominent themes. And so themes are broader overarching ideas supported by specific evidence. And so I have an example from another course, my American history course, where we also work at this. And so if we look at the original colonies, that was the early 1600s in America. The original colonies was a time of exploration and settlement, extreme hardship, and horrible exploitation. And so each of those are broader themes, and they're supported with specific evidence. So if we look at extreme hardship, that might be a little hard to read there, but that's okay. One of the examples I give there is that 60% of settlers who went to the original colony settlement of Jamestown died. So that would indeed be specific evidence that, this was a time of extreme hardship. And so students are exemplar there, and then they're encouraged to finish off the sentence. The French Revolution was a time of blank, blank, and blank, supported by specific evidence. And so we could say the French Revolution was a time of monumental government change. And we could say that, well, one of the examples there is that the great Bourbon dynasty of the French monarchy was overthrown. Right? That was significant change. And also, we have the introduction of a democratic system of government with a constitution. Again, by no means did that go smoothly. A lot of it was a mess. But nonetheless, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was developed, which was a very influential document. And then students could go on to develop other prominent themes and support that with evidence as well, too. And then the final task, if you can turn to the next page, is actually answering the central question of the week. And so again, the central question of the week is, did the French Revolution truly reflect enlightened ideals, or were they simply used by the leaders of the movement, like Robespierre, to gain further power? And so this is not a question where students can just quickly answer and just gather information and so on. It's a question where, yeah, I need to think about that, because you know what, there's different positions that can be formed. On the one hand, we can certainly see that, enlightened ideals are evident. The attempt to limit the power of the king, the attempt to develop a provisional democratic government supported by a constitution. Those are all examples of enlightened ideals that came out of the Enlightenment. On the other hand, from 1792 to 1794, that time period was known as the Reign of Terror. That's when the guillotines were going nonstop. And the individual I identified before, Maximilien Robespierre, he was in power. And anybody who was deemed to be potentially, against the movement, their name was put on a list and they would be executed. So it became a society that was based on fear and intimidation, and where power was very much centralized around Robespierre. And that's in direct contrast with the Enlightenment and enlightened ideals. And so in many ways, it forces students to evaluate that, okay, on the one hand, position number one, certainly we can see all of that evidence. But on the other hand, under Robespierre and the Reign of Terror and the guillotine, those things seem like a very, very clear contradiction of the Enlightenment. So it's again encouraging students to work towards answering a very challenging question that forces them to think, ultimately developing critical thinking skills. So these set of different skills and tasks that I've put together here, at the end of each week, students do these tasks, whichever the topic it is of the week, and they either do it in physical form on this sheet, they do this in the form of a question or a discussion with their parent. And I think collaboration between the parent and the student is really, really important, that it not simply be a course where, hey, here's the workbook, don't bother me again, I'll see you in 4 months. And so parents do need to be involved in the learning process. And that conversation with parents, every 3 weeks is really important. And then the other option is to do a informal presentation through an online page I use called Flipgrid, and students will record themselves responding to these different tasks.
Oh, nice.
So again, working on these skills every week, by doing that, I always notice that by the end of the course, my students have really, really improved. And that's really encouraging to see.
So I've got your book here. So I'll show all our viewers this, and you can see the thickness of that too. So but I also know, so I have not started this yet with my especially my oldest son. I could actually see my younger son still being in on conversations, maybe not doing as much of the work. Now, Mike has created this for grade 11 and 12, right?
Yeah, grade 11, 12 are typically the best fit. Yeah.
And I am going to do this with my son a little younger. And even as I hear you talk, though, so he's 15, even as I hear you talk, it makes me want to do it even a little bit more for the reason of my own benefit. Like, I actually think it's just going to train me a little bit better to use these kind of getting my kids to think deeper, because I really try to do that in different ways, but I'm not great unless it's built into something we do regularly. Now, we do something like we read the Bible, and when we read the Bible, we'll usually have a talk about the topic. And sometimes I'll just, so what was interesting to you in this topic, or what do you want to make a comment on, right? So there's that little bit of what we're doing there. Sometimes we're watching movies or shows or documentaries, and we'll use that as that little catalyst to have those conversations that are a little bit deeper. But I like this, that it's a very structured way and how to get them to think. And I wanted to point out, just as you were talking about that thematic package. So first I was wondering, so is that in this book, or is that, because I know there's lots of digital things that go with the course as well.
Yeah.
I've got those links. So are these thematic package, is that part of this workbook?
Yeah. At the end of each topic, so Friday of each week, students will either do that thematic package in a physical form, so it'll appear in the workbook, or they'll do the content of that thematic package in the form of a conversation with parents. And I have a whole template for that, with Google Drive, which they also get access to, or they'll do a brief informal presentation covering those topics. So either three of the options, they're still working on evaluating change and continuity, transformational change, opposing forces, prominent themes, and the central question. And each of those skills, you can take those skills and you can apply them in pretty much any other course, any other social science course. So when you're, reading a book, you can ask them, well, after reading a chapter, what are some opposing forces that you see present in the book? This character and what he stands for is opposing this character and what she stands for. And what are some examples of change or continuity from this chapter of the book? And you can also say, well, if you were to choose three prominent themes from this chapter, what would they be? So anyone can take these skills from the thematic package, these tasks, and apply them to virtually any other social science course or an English course. And that's another way of developing it. So it's not rocket science to pick and choose those things from the thematic package and just pose those questions informally to your son or daughter. And that can be done at a much younger age too, just asking those different questions.
Mm-hmm. I find that a start, which I think I've been lacking on. And I'm just sort of like the light bulb is going on in my head of like, there are so many opportunities. And I mentioned a few of them that we use in our home just casually. But I'm definitely looking for ways to get a little bit more strategic, I guess is my word I'm going to use for that. A little bit more strategic in how I'm getting my kids to think. And this
Yep.
is definitely a good resource to do that.
And another tip too is so what's becoming more common as well too is to use a whiteboard as kind of just an opportunity to gather ideas.
Okay.
And so there's an educational professor who Pierre Lillodahl, and he's developed this practice, and he actually developed it for math. But I heard a presentation on it, and I've used a lot of those things for history now. And so I'll have my students, and you can do this together, like as a family, where okay, on a whiteboard, let's write down 3 prominent themes that we just came across in this chapter, and write them out. And it actually, in terms of brain development and so on, it works differently to actually do it collaboratively and on a whiteboard that you can erase, as opposed to just writing it down on a piece of paper. And so that's another way, an easy way to do things at home, is to have a whiteboard at home as a place for brainstorming. And you'll often see this within the business sector of the world too, where they have that whiteboard where they can write down ideas and collaborate and so on. And there's actually research that supports that this can be very, very helpful in developing critical thinking. And it can be used very informally as well too.
Yeah, we have a whiteboard, and I have it up when I moved here about a year ago, a little over a year ago. Kind of put it on a nice spot in our wall, and I have not used it since. I haven't. I used to use it just in different courses and different things we were doing. It's great to use that. So yeah, that's awesome. I'm going to use that.
You can take each of those tasks from the thematic package, and you can very easily use those on the whiteboard as a kind of culminating activity, informal thing with many different subjects and topics. So the thinker behind that is Pierre Lillodahl. He's originally from Sweden. He actually was a Olympic athlete in Spain, Barcelona in 1992. So I have heard him speak once, and he again developed that for math. But I have found it very helpful within the social sciences as well too.
Yeah, and a lot of other topics, subjects as well.
Yeah.
That kind of going across the board there. Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Mike. This has been a great talk for me. I'm so glad that we're going to have this resource, because I can also see referring to it regularly. So whether you are watching on Facebook or YouTube, feel free to share this video. We will also add links here, like you can comment here if you have any questions, and we'll come back to this. We'll see your comment and we'll get back to you on that. And yeah, well, thank you very much for joining us, Mike.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope you have a great rest of the summer.
Yes, thank you. You as well. Okay, bye, everyone.